World War III has already begun. That's an extreme statement, one that bears a heavy burden of proof. You should be skeptical. However, it's important to note that real skepticism is not blind disbelief, but rather the suspension of belief until sufficient evidence is provided. In this video, we're going to provide you with that evidence. Everything we talk about here will be documented in links in the description. I strongly encourage you to do your own research and to verify what we're talking about. Let's start with the definition of a world war. World War I and World War II weren't named as such because they involved every single country on the planet, but rather because these conflicts drew in the most powerful nations and were spread out over a large geographical area. Now, though the reductionist history we're taught in school marks the beginnings of the first two world wars at specific physical flashpoints such as Hitler's invasion of Poland for Europe or the attack on Pearl Harbor for the United States, the early stages of these conflicts had actually begun to develop many years prior. For example, Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor was a culmination of many months of intentional provocation by the US. This was revealed in the 8 Points Bulletin, which was declassified years later, but it's still never mentioned in textbooks. Likewise, the mutual defense treaties which were immediately activated by this attack were already in place, and the secondary results could have easily been predicted by anyone who had been paying attention. Unfortunately, at that time, the internet wasn't available. The public was caught completely off guard. World War I planted the seeds for World War II, which transitioned directly into the Cold War. In the post-World War II era, the advent of the CIA and the strategy of using politically motivated NGOs to destabilize countries changed the way war was waged, placing a much greater emphasis on covert operations and proxy wars than outright combat. Such operations blurred the definition of war, particularly in the mind of the public, and it made it much harder to define clear start points and end points. Can you name all the countries the US toppled between 1950 and 1991? Most people can't. The end of the Cold War and the power vacuum that the fall of the Soviet Union created invited 20 years of military expansionism on the part of the United States. And this laid the groundwork for the next global conflict. This next global conflict is what we're referring to as World War III. Now, to establish this is in fact a world war, let's first take a look at the geographic scope of the current conflicts underway. Afghanistan is still clearly occupied by US forces, and as the official military prepares to withdraw in 2014, private military forces are being brought in. Also, there are no plans to discontinue the drone program in Afghanistan anytime soon. The Iraq War is supposedly over, and there's been a drastic drawdown of US troops. However, the overt occupation is now being replaced by a covert occupation run by the CIA, which has one of its largest stations in Baghdad. Obama has expanded Bush's drone program into Yemen, Somalia, Algeria, Libya, and Pakistan. In parallel, the Dagger Brigade has deployed US forces to 35 African countries this year, and the Pentagon has put boots on the ground in Mali as of April. And let's not forget that Obama toppled the Libyan government in 2011. The US has been running intensive war games and drills with South Korea since February, and they are ongoing in spite of the lack of media attention in the past month. North Korea is calling these drills, which included simulated nuclear strikes and naval maneuvers, wanton provocations and rehearsals for war. This really isn't an exaggeration since the US just recently signed a mutual defense treaty with South Korea, which makes it significantly easier for the US to get militarily involved in that region. The US has pushed for multiple rounds of sanctions against Iran, supposedly to discourage them from building a nuke, even though the CIA and Mossad both agree that the Iranian leadership hasn't even made the decision to build a bomb, much less even start. The US and Israeli governments aren't one to let pesky little things like facts keep them from promoting military strikes on Iran, but since they haven't gotten much traction with this approach from the international community, they've moved on to less direct tactics. And that brings us to Syria. Iran's closest ally is Syria. And on Friday, May 3rd, 2013, Israel attacked Syria. This after their attempt at framing the Syrian government for chemical weapons fell apart. The US has been stepping up its material support for the Syrian rebels, though they still publicly claim that they aren't supplying them with weapons. This is just a public relations smokescreen. On May 26, Lebanon was attacked by NATO-backed insurgents due to Hezbollah's support for the Syrian government. Russia has taken a firm stand against US, NATO, and Israeli attempts to topple the Syrian government, and is still planning to send a shipment of S-300 anti-aircraft missiles to the country. In response, Israel's President Netanyahu reportedly warned Putin that Moscow's sale of the sophisticated missile defense system to Assad could push the Middle East into war, and argued that the S-300 had no relevance to Assad's internal battles against rebel groups. This statement, coming right on the heels of the unprovoked Israeli airstrikes on Damascus this month, leaves little doubt as to what these missiles are intended for and why Israel is angry. Of course, Netanyahu doesn't like this. He wants to be able to continue attacking Syria with impunity. Now, this past week, Russia moved a group of warships from their Pacific Fleet into the Eastern Mediterranean for the first time in decades to, quote, protect Russia's interest in the region. This move counters the US naval presence, which has built up in the area over the past several years. Both of these moves are direct statements about their intentions regarding Syria and Iran. This is only a rough summary of the early stages of this conflict. Much is being left out here. But this should be enough to establish this is indeed a world war. Now as for the players, how are they divided? Who's allied with who? On one side we have China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Syria, and a handful of nations in South America. The role of the South American nations in this conflict has been strictly economic, but as we'll discuss later, economics is central in this crisis. On the other side we have the United States, Israel, and NATO, which includes most of Western Europe, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and a handful of others. So clearly the most powerful nations in the world are involved. If tomorrow a direct war between the United States and Russia were to break out, this would mark the official beginning of World War III. But obviously this wouldn't really be accurate. A proxy war between the US and Russia is already underway in Syria and in Iran, and a currency war is already underway between the United States and China. The question here is really only one of scale. How far will this go? Will the US and its allies back down before this escalates into an open war involving the big players? Obviously it's impossible to answer that question with 100% certainty. These are human decisions, and even madmen sometimes have moments of lucidity. However, when you understand why these wars are happening, it becomes clear that it is highly unlikely that the US and its allies will back down. So why is this happening? What is the motive for this aggressive posture by the United States and its allies? We've talked about this in detail in a number of videos, including The Road to World War III, which explains the history of the petrodollar and how it pertains to this current conflict. So we won't rehash all those details here. But to summarize, this war is a war for the control of the global financial system. The dollar is nearing the end of its days, and the powers that be know this. They could let the dollar fall and allow the rest of the world to choose their own course. But they don't want to. The powers that be would much rather take a gamble and stake it all in an attempt to control the currency that will replace the dollar. If they have it their way, this new currency will be a truly global currency.
I think we've all got to move towards that opportunity, and I think the challenge also is whether we should move towards an international currency, because the speculation and the complexity of currency has caused some of the irritation, not only among the trading nations, but among individuals.
This global currency will be accompanied by global government, which they will claim is necessary to prevent another tragic war like the one they're setting off right now. It's a classic problem-reaction-solution setup, where those that create the problem manipulate the public into accepting a solution that puts more power into their hands. They are going to attempt this one way or another. If they don't, then they will lose everything. The question is, how will we respond? Will you fall for this? Will you send your sons and daughters to fight in these corrupt wars with your eyes closed and your hand on your heart? Or will you at least speak out? This is the real variable. This is what will determine the final outcome. If you appreciate this message and if you want others to hear it, you can help by liking this video, adding it to your favorites, and sharing it to Facebook, Twitter, your blog, and by sending it to your friends via email. If you'd like more videos like this, subscribe to Storm Clouds Gathering on YouTube. For updates and bonus content, be sure to follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/stormcloudsgathering, on Twitter at Collapse Updates, and our website is stormcloudsgathering.com.
All right, reports of North Korea now. Nuclear threats out of North Korea targeting the U.S., saying it has placed long-range missiles into combat mode aimed at numerous Western targets. Ambassador John Bolton, former U.S. ambassador to the UN, Fox News contributor with me now. And, sir, good morning to you. More words or more than that?
Well, I think the threat to use missiles against targets in the United States like Alaska, Hawaii, or bases like in Guam or Okinawa is probably remote as of this moment. But make no mistake, the North Koreans are getting closer to making those threats a reality, and their ability to hit closer targets in Japan or South Korea can't be dismissed. I think the most immediate concern is that with all this belligerent talk, there is a risk of North Korea taking some provocative action, sinking a South Korean ship as they did a little over a year ago, or doing something that could get us very quickly into a larger confrontation. This is a very dangerous regime. It is not rational in our terms, and even though their more extravagant threats are not realistic, you have to take this kind of thing seriously.
Let me pick up on the point you make, because they have threatened in the past and they have acted on those threats, especially when it comes to their South Korean neighbor down here across the 38th parallel, Japan off to the east. But specifically for Western targets, American targets, they've talked about Guam, they've talked about Hawaii, they've talked about certain Western American cities that we can show you on the map here in just a moment once it pulls up here. You know, whether you apply truth to this or not, Mr. Ambassador, It is fair to say that they cannot take a nuclear warhead and put it on a rocket, but they can take a long-range rocket and perhaps, you know, aim at Anchorage or Seattle, or more likely out here, Honolulu, Hawaii, or Guam. Is that the more likely scenario when it comes to the United States?
Well, I think that is possible now. Now, people say, well, why would they do anything so foolish? The United States would retaliate overwhelmingly. It would be a disastrous mistake for South Korea to do it. That's only if you think North Korea's leadership is just as rational as we are. It's called mirror imaging. It's a real problem at the State Department. You're a reasonable guy. You think the people on the other side of the negotiating table are reasonable. Not necessarily. And it's the kind of Hitler in the bunker mentality that has pervaded the North Korean leadership's thinking over the years that really should worry us. It shows why the continuation of the regime itself in North Korea is a problem that we need to be addressing really just as much as the nuclear capability they're seeking.
We've addressed this, too, just in the past 10 days or so. I mean, this is a long-range missile, animation here behind us here from North Korea. If that were to launch, we have just taken more anti-missile batteries and moved them now to the West Coast. Initially, they had been planned. They were canceled by the current administration, and now they have reversed course. Would that serve logic in order to prevent a possible hit on the western part of the U.S.?
Well, I think we should have done it. We should have deployed these missiles in 2009 when they were originally scheduled, and although there was great fanfare for that announcement, they won't actually be deployed until 2017. But it's intended to protect innocent American populations against this kind of threat from rogue states. It's why we need a much more robust national missile defense capability than the Obama administration's planning, and we need, as our military has done, overflying North Korea recently, to have the capability to respond, to try to deter this irrational regime. But it's not a place we should want to be. I think our objective here should be the elimination of the North Korean regime, the peaceful reunification of the peninsula. We've said that's our policy since 1945. We need to act on it.
One more point here. They shelled an island 3 years ago, killed 4 people. They're responsible for killing 46 sailors when they sank a South Korean naval ship. But back to your first answer, you believe that action is more likely, if any, at this time?
Yeah, in both those cases, the South Korean government, even though it was under a relatively conservative president at the time, took no retaliatory action. Opinion in South Korea was very negative on the lack of retaliation. So you've got a newly elected president in South Korea now. If there's another incident like that, killing South Korean military personnel or civilians, I think the pressure for retaliation would be high. And that's how a miscalculation on North Korea's part could get us into something very, very serious with American troops there on the peninsula.
Thank you, sir. John Bolton. Mr. Ambassador from Washington.
The North Korean video shows the White House in the crosshairs, the U.S. Capitol blowing up. The latest messages posted by the North Korean government online, a further sign of what the U.S. worries is an increasingly unpredictable Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader who threatens war with the United States and South Korea. On CNN's The Lead, the president's chief of staff told Jake Tapper the U.S. will be ready for any provocation.
Obviously, the kind of antics and the kind of language that we've heard from them, to include what you've just shown on your show here, are the kinds of actions that don't connote strength, but rather connote some kind of weakness and, frankly, outlandish behavior.
Even before this video, the U.S. intelligence community had a grim outlook.
The rhetoric, while it is propaganda-laced, is also an indicator of their attitude and perhaps their intent. So for my part, I am very concerned about what they might do.
The latest video is full of images of the North Korean military. The announcer says the fuse of nuclear war is slowly burning.
The fuse of nuclear war is slowly burning.
And that there will be, quote, no warning of North Korean plans.
The sheer threat that they would openly threaten a nuclear attack against the United States is problem enough. But their military movements along the DMZ, the demilitarized zone in North Korea, a whole new set of problems for us.
The White House is taking all of this very seriously because the U.S. cannot predict if and when threats might become a military confrontation.
So you have a 28-year-old leader who is trying to prove himself to the military, and the military eager to have a sable rattling for their own self-interest. And the combination of that is proving to be very, very deadly.